talented black mechanic never expected that stopping to help a stranger on a dark, empty road would change his life forever. He was just a mechanic, a man with grease-stained hands and a dream too big for his wallet. But fate had a strange way of working. One small act of kindness, one decision to pull over instead of driving past, would set off a chain of events leading to an opportunity that could turn his dream into reality. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. John Carter had always been a man of perseverance. Born and raised in the heart of New Orleans, he grew up surrounded by the sound of revving engines and the scent of motor oil. From an early age he was fascinated by cars, how they worked, how they moved, how each part fit together like a puzzle that only the most skilled hands could solve. While other kids played video games or rode their bikes around the neighborhood, John spent hours tinkering with old engines in his uncle's backyard, learning through trial and error until he could take apart and rebuild an entire motor with his eyes closed. Life hadn't been easy for him. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he learned the value of hard work from his mother, a woman who held down 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. His father had never been in the picture, and without a strong male figure to guide him, John found his role models in the men who worked with their hands: mechanics, construction workers, welders. They were the ones who shaped his view of the world, teaching him that a man's worth wasn't measured by the money he had but by the skills he carried and the integrity with which he used them. By the time he was in his early 20s, John had already built a reputation for himself as one of the most skilled mechanics in his neighborhood. People trusted him because he was honest. He wouldn't upsell unnecessary repairs or cut corners. He treated every car as if it belonged to his own family. That dedication eventually landed him a stable job at Tony's Auto Garage, a small but well-known repair shop on the outskirts of the city. The owner, Tony, was an old-school mechanic who had been in the business for over 30 years. He took a liking to John, seeing in him the same hunger and passion he once had as a young man. Now at 35, John was one of the best mechanics at the shop. There wasn't a car he couldn't fix, and customers specifically requested him when they brought their vehicles in. His hands were always covered in grease, his work boots worn down from years of standing, but he wouldn't have it any other way. He loved his job. Still, deep down, he knew he was capable of more. For years, he had dreamed of opening his own auto shop, a place where he could build something for himself, a business he could pass down to his future children. He had saved every extra dollar he could, tucking it away in a savings account, but the reality was harsh. Opening a proper garage with the right equipment, the right location, and the right team would cost at least $100,000. He had barely managed to save a fraction of that. Loans were an option, but banks weren't keen on lending to someone with no assets or collateral. So for now, his dream remained just that, a dream. Still, John wasn't bitter about it. He was a realist. He knew success didn't come overnight, and he was willing to put in the years of hard work necessary to get there. What he didn't know, however, was that life had a way of throwing unexpected opportunities in one's path, opportunities disguised as chance encounters, opportunities that could change everything in the blink of an eye. And on one particular night, as he locked up Tony's auto garage and headed home, exhausted from another long shift, fate was about to put him to the test. As John Carter drove down the quiet streets of New Orleans that night, the familiar hum of his old pickup truck was the only sound accompanying him. The city, which was usually alive with music and chatter, felt different at this hour, quieter, almost eerie. Streetlights cast long shadows over the pavement, and the occasional flickering neon sign was the only reminder that life still stirred somewhere beyond the empty roads. It had been an exhausting day at the garage, a never-ending stream of customers needing repairs, and all he wanted now was to get home, take a long shower, and collapse onto his couch. But as he turned onto a more secluded stretch of road, something caught his eye. A car pulled over on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking in the darkness. John's first instinct was to keep driving. It was late, and the neighborhood wasn't exactly the safest place to be stopping for strangers. But as he got closer, he could make out a lone figure standing beside the stalled vehicle, a woman, dressed in what looked like expensive business attire, pacing in frustration as she examined the engine. She looked out of place here, like she belonged in a corporate office or a 5-star restaurant, not stranded on the side of a dimly lit road. He exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel as he debated with himself. It wasn't his problem. He was tired. But then he thought of his mother, of the time she had been stuck in situations where she had to rely on the kindness of strangers. If she were in this woman's shoes, he'd hope someone would stop to help her. With a resigned sigh, John pulled over, shifting his truck into park before stepping out onto the pavement. "Looks like you're having some trouble," he called out as he approached, keeping his voice steady but non-threatening. The woman turned sharply, her guarded expression momentarily softening as she took him in. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp green eyes that still held traces of annoyance from whatever had gone wrong with her car. "Yes, you could say that," she sighed, running a hand through her dark brown hair. "I have no idea what happened. One minute everything was fine, the next the engine just died." John nodded, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated for a second, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, sure. At this point, I'll take any help I can get." John popped the hood, letting the warm engine heat wash over him as he examined the components with a practiced eye. It didn't take long for him to spot the problem, a minor electrical issue that had shut the system down. It was a quick fix, something that would take him less than 10 minutes. He reached into his truck for his toolkit, rolling up his sleeves as he got to work. As he tightened a loose connection, the woman folded her arms and leaned against the car, watching him. "You seem to know what you're doing," she commented. John chuckled, not looking up. "Been working on cars since I was a kid. It's what I do." "Well, I appreciate it," she said sincerely. "I wasn't sure what I was going to do out here this late." "You're lucky," John remarked. "Not a lot of people pass through this road at this hour." "I know," she admitted, glancing around. "I was on my way home from a business trip. I closed a pretty big deal today, and I was supposed to be celebrating with my family tonight. But instead, I'm standing here, waiting for my car to betray me." John smirked as he finished up, wiping his hands on a rag before stepping back. "Well, good news. Your car's not a traitor, just a little stubborn. Try starting it now." She arched a brow but did as he said, sliding into the driver's seat and turning the key. The engine roared back to life without hesitation. Her face lit up with relief as she let out a breath. "Oh, thank God. You just saved me from a complete disaster." John waved a hand dismissively. It was nothing, just a quick fix. She reached for her purse, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. "At least let me pay you for your time." John shook his head. "No need. I was just helping out." The woman frowned, clearly not used to people refusing money. "Come on, I insist. I probably kept you from getting home after a long day." "You did," John admitted with a chuckle. "But seriously, don't worry about it." She studied him for a moment before tucking the wallet away, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "Okay, if you won't take my money, at least let me have your business card or something. You're too good at this not to have your own shot." John hesitated for a second before reaching into his back pocket and pulling out a slightly worn card from Tony's Auto Garage. "I don't own it, but this is where I work. If you ever need help, you can find me there." She took the card, glancing at it before slipping it into her purse. "I'll keep that in mind." She smiled then, a genuine one this time. "By the way, I never caught your name." "John," he said simply. She extended a hand. "Sophia. Sophia Bennett." John shook her hand briefly before stepping back. "Well, Sophia, you should be good to go. Just keep an eye on it. If anything else acts up, bring it to a shop to get checked out properly." "Noted," she said as she shifted the car into gear. "Thanks again, John. I really appreciate it." "Drive safe," he said, watching as she pulled back onto the road. John waited until her taillights disappeared into the distance before heading back to his truck. As he slid behind the wheel, he shook his head slightly, exhaling. He didn't think much of the encounter. It wasn't the first time he had helped a stranger on the road, and it wouldn't be the last. To him, it was just another moment in a long day. What he didn't know, however, was that his small act of kindness had set something in motion, something that would change the course of his life in ways he never could have imagined. The next evening, John found himself back at Tony's Auto Garage, working late again. The shop had officially closed an hour ago, but he had stayed behind to finish up a particularly tricky repair on an old Chevrolet that had been giving him trouble all day. The rest of the crew had gone home, leaving the garage quiet except for the occasional clank of metal and the hum of the radio playing softly in the background. It was how John preferred it, no distractions, just him and the machinery, working together in perfect sync. As he tightened the last bolt, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, he heard the unmistakable sound of a luxury car pulling up outside. The deep, purring engine of a Rolls-Royce wasn't something you heard often in this part of town. Curious, he set down his wrench and stepped out from under the hood, his hands still covered in grease. The car, sleek and immaculately polished, came to a slow stop in front of the garage. The doors opened in near silence, and stepping out first was Sophia Bennett, looking more polished than she had the night before. Gone was the frustration of being stranded tonight. She carried herself with ease, dressed in an elegant yet simple outfit that screamed quiet wealth. But it wasn't just her. A tall, distinguished man emerged from the driver's side, his suit perfectly tailored, his silver hair neatly combed back. Even without an introduction, John knew who he was. Richard Bennett. John had heard the name before. It was hard not to, especially in New Orleans. Richard Bennett was one of the city's most influential businessmen, a man known for his strategic mind and ability to turn failing companies into thriving empires. He wasn't just rich, he was the kind of rich that made people pay attention when he walked into a room. John wiped his hands on a rag as they approached. He wasn't the type to be intimidated by wealth, but he couldn't help but wonder why one of the most powerful men in the city had just pulled up to his workplace. Sophia, he greeted, nodding at her before turning his attention to Richard. And you must be her father. Richard extended his hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. Richard Bennett. And you must be John Carter, the man my daughter hasn't stopped talking about since last night. John raised an eyebrow, glancing at Sophia, who simply smiled. That so? Sophia shrugged. You saved my night. That doesn't happen often. John chuckled, folding his arms. Well, I appreciate the visit, but I take it this isn't just a social call. Richard's lips curled slightly, as if he appreciated John's directness. No, it's not. We wanted to speak with you in person. Do you have a moment? John motioned toward the garage. Sure, come on in. He led them inside, the scent of motor oil and rubber filling the air. It wasn't a luxury office, but this was John's world, and he was comfortable here. He grabbed a couple of stools from the workbench, offering them seats before leaning against the metal tool chest himself. Richard studied the surroundings for a moment before speaking. I'll get straight to the point, John. I appreciate what you did for my daughter last night, not just fixing her car, but refusing payment. That tells me something about you. John shrugged. I didn't do it for recognition. Just seemed like the right thing to do. Richard nodded, as if that was exactly the answer he had expected. That's a rare thing these days. People don't often help without expecting something in return. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp blue eyes locking onto John's. Tell me something, do you like working here? John hesitated for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wasn't sure where this was going. I like what I do. I like working on cars, solving problems. But if you're asking whether I want to be a mechanic for someone else for the rest of my life, then no. I've got bigger goals than that. Richard smiled, glancing briefly at Sophia before turning back to John. That's what I thought. He straightened, adjusting the cuff of his suit. Sophia told me you've been wanting to open your own shop. John's jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't used to discussing his dreams with strangers, let alone men like Richard Bennett. Yeah, it's something I've been working toward, but a dream doesn't mean much without the money to make it happen. Richard leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. That's why we're here. I want to invest in you, John. $100,000, no strings attached, no debt hanging over your head. Just an investment in your talent and potential. John stared at him for a moment, certain he had misheard. Sophia was watching him carefully, waiting for his reaction. You're offering me $100,000, John said slowly, because I helped your daughter fix a car. Richard let out a low chuckle. No, John. I'm offering you an investment because I believe in people who have both skill and character. Sophia saw something in you, and after what she told me, I wanted to see for myself. I don't throw money around for no reason. I invest in things I think will grow. And I think you're worth betting on." John exhaled, running a hand over his head. He wasn't a man who got flustered easily, but this was a lot to process. He looked at Sophia. "And you agree with this?" She nodded. "Completely. I know a good business mind when I see one. You may not realize it yet, but you have everything it takes to run a successful shop. You just need the resources to make it happen." John glanced between the two of them, still grappling with the sheer insanity of the situation. This morning he had woken up thinking today would be just like any other. And now, a billionaire was sitting in his garage, offering him the kind of opportunity that most people only dreamed of. But he wasn't naive. He had spent too much of his life working from the ground up to believe in handouts. His pride wouldn't let him take something for nothing. He crossed his arms. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't take charity." Richard studied him for a long moment before smiling. "That's exactly why I'm making it. This isn't charity, John. It's a business decision. If you fail, I lose my investment, simple as that. But I don't think you'll fail. I think you'll build something great. And one day you'll remember this conversation not as a favor, but as the start of something much bigger." John remained silent, his mind racing. Richard leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Opportunities like this don't come often, son. But when they do, the only question is, are you ready to take them?" John sat there, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Richard Bennett's as the weight of the moment settled over him like a heavy blanket. $100,000. Not a loan. Not a gift. An investment. The kind of opportunity that didn't just fall into a mechanic's lap, hell, the kind of opportunity that didn't fall into anyone's lap. And yet, here it was, staring him in the face, wrapped up in the confident gaze of one of the most powerful businessmen in the city. He could feel the tension in his own chest, that old, familiar instinct to be cautious creeping in. He had spent his whole life working for everything he had, scraping by, taking pride in the fact that nothing had ever been handed to him. This felt too big, too sudden. A small part of him, the part that had seen people get burned by deals that seemed too good to be true, wanted to say no, wanted to walk away before he owed anyone anything. But then there was the other part. The part of him that had spent years dreaming of something bigger, years staring at other people's names on garage doors, wondering if he'd ever see his own up there. The part of him that knew, deep down, that if he turned this down, he might never get another chance like it. John exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I need to ask you something," he said finally, his voice measured. "Why me?" Richard leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "Because I've spent my entire career betting on people, John. Not companies. Not trends. People. And I've learned to recognize the ones who have something real, something worth investing in. I see it in you. The way you carry yourself. The way you take pride in your work. The way you turned down money last night. Not because you didn't need it, but because you weren't doing it for the money." He paused, eyes sharp. "That tells me everything I need to know." John let that sink in. He looked at Sophia, who gave him a small, knowing smile, like she had already figured out what his answer would be before he even did. He looked around the garage, at the tools he had used every day for the past 5 years, the cracked concrete floors, the old workbench covered in oil stains and worn-down rags. This wasn't his. It had never been his. He had always been just another worker here. Then he thought about what his own shop would look like, his name on the door, his rules, his future. He took a deep breath. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I'm in." A slow, satisfied smile spread across Richard's face. "Good. I had a feeling you would be." Sophia grinned. "Took you long enough." John shook his head, chuckling under his breath. "Yeah, well, I had to make sure I wasn't selling my soul or something." Richard let out a low chuckle. "No souls required. Just hard work. And from what I've seen, that won't be a problem for you." They spent the next hour going over the details. Richard explained that the money would be wired to him within 2 days. No contracts, no fine print, just an investment based on a handshake and trust. He didn't want a cut of the business, didn't want his name on anything. The only thing he asked for was John's best effort. John promised he'd deliver. 2 months later. The grand opening of Carter's Auto Works was bigger than John had ever imagined. The new garage sat on a prime lot on the edge of the city, with a sleek sign above the entrance, his name, bold and proud, for the world to see. The inside was spotless, freshly painted walls, top-of-the-line tools, and brand-new lifts that actually worked without needing a swift kick to start. And the customers. They came, not just because of the shop's modern look, but because of John himself. His reputation had followed him. People who had been coming to him for years at Tony's now brought their business to Carter's Auto Works. Word spread fast. One customer turned into 5. 5 turned into 20. Within a month, he had to hire 2 more mechanics just to keep up with demand. It was his, finally. Sophia stopped by often, sometimes under the excuse of needing a routine checkup on her car, but mostly just to see how things were going. Their conversations had become easier, more familiar, filled with inside jokes and business talk. She had an eye for strategy, and John wasn't too proud to admit that some of her suggestions had helped him streamline the shop's operations. As for Richard, he visited every now and then, but never as an investor checking in on his money, just as a friend watching something he had believed in come to life. One evening, as they stood outside the garage, watching the last customer of the day drive off, Richard glanced at John with a satisfied nod. "I told you," he said simply. "You were worth betting on." John smiled, shaking his head. Yeah, all right. I'll admit it, you were right." Richard chuckled. "Get used to saying that. I usually am." John laughed, glancing up at his own name above the shop one more time, feeling the weight of everything it had taken to get here. He thought about that night on the side of the road, about how a simple act of kindness had led to this. It was a lesson he'd never forget, that sometimes the biggest opportunities come from the smallest moments. And as he locked up the shop for the night, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.